Welcome along. It is the polling station. Johnny Ward and William Kedjanyi. We have some very interesting Q&A participants that we're going to get to later on in the show. But William, I did tell you before the show, I'm going to throw a little curveball at you.
Oh, Lord.
A little curveball.
Go on.
So I spent some of last night watching the first episode of the Thatcher documentary on BBC4, which I have recorded.
Yeah.
And then I spent the first start of today reading an article by a former ambassador to Britain who was just on about Brexit and the slow dawning and realization in Britain of what Brexit will actually mean. So I put it to you, does Brexit and the fact that people voted for this, is this directly related to the change in British society that pretty much followed on from the Thatcher measures of her time in her 10 years in charge, and maybe the isolation that left in some of these towns and cities around the country?
That's a brilliant curveball. I think in a great part, yes. I think the effect Thatcher had on certain communities and certainly Thatcherite politics has a big part to play in Brexit. The interesting thing about this is that Thatcher, while she was, very much somebody who really stood up for Britain on the international stage, she did believe in cooperation, and that did include Europe. So there's an interesting disconnect here between, and again, this is really subject to what people believe, there's lots of different opinions on it, but there's an interesting disconnect to me between the effect of Thatcherite politics and where people voted to leave, and also actually the way Thatcher viewed her relationship with the European Union.
Okay, that's the curveball out of the way. We've lots to talk about in British politics this week. Let's start with the London mayoral race and another fascinating aspect of this, obviously. What have you got to tell us?
Yeah, so as part of the Q&A later, and we will sort of refer back to that, we got an interesting reply from Neil Channing, of course, who is doing our Christmas challenge, 12 days of Channing. I speak on the second day of Channing, and he asked basically, who's going to come second? And I think actually this might be something we could look into, because Sadiq Khan basically is in the virtual equivalent of having to just get round, except there aren't really that many hurdles for him. There's a poll taken by Queen Mary University. It puts him 20% ahead. There's no real danger. The Sean Bailey campaign, I think it's fair to say, has been awful. And the others don't really get much of a look in. Khan, I think, is one of those people who, in a way, sort of like the SNP, is benefiting from voter coalitions that are sort of top-sided against one another, a united voting coalition with no real alternatives, though we will speak actually later about the Greens. So the interesting thing we might look into next year will be to be runner-up and also to be third, because the latest polling put Sean Berry, this is with YouGov and Queen Mary University of London, put Sean Berry 5% ahead of the Lib Dem candidates. And that actually, it is a really interesting market. I think it could get quite competitive, but that's one of a number of things to think ahead of next year, because we've spoken about this before, but people generally sort of post election think, oh, what's going to happen now in politics? Well, actually, there's a hell of a lot into 2021. Local elections carried forward from this year, the London mayoral race. Not just that, but early in the year, we'll talk about this later, the Georgia Senate runoffs, and many other things besides. So that'll be something to look out for next year when it comes fully into view. And it's been a very topsy-turvy year for London. And I think, if anything, the events of the past few months have underlined the sort of titanic importance of London to British politics. And I do not think, by the way, in a good sense, but that's a question for well down the road.
Obviously, the approval of the Pfizer vaccine was big news this morning. So I imagine politically, this is, great for Boris Johnson. He needs a bit of good news. Everyone needs a bit of good news. People need to be looking forward to 2021. What is going on over there? What have you got to update me?
It's great news for Boris Johnson, assuming the rollout goes well. Now, we have been told by various scientific experts and various ministers that we can expect to be doing things like let's say going to the races en masse by the middle of next summer, I think would be fair. You know, I think it'd be a reasonable expectation to say go to Royal Ascot this year, and not have to worry about so much, even though I don't think it'll be completely back to normal. That's a lovely thing to look forward to, but from a political sense, it's a big job getting this vaccine now, and it has to be done right. Get it wrong, I really don't think the British public will forgive and forget. And we have to remember, actually, Labour and the Tories are neck and neck in the polls on average, but that's down quite a lot from the landslide, relatively, that they had in December. I think it's a fair argument to say that the British public don't approve of the handling of the pandemic to this point. Go on.
Yeah.
But just quickly, we actually do have a new marketer, Boris Johnson, to be the Prime Minister by the next general election. With 5 to 4, he is. 4 to 7, he isn't. I imagine that will be a market which gets a lot of play coming into the next year. We're also still 11 to 8 on him leaving office next year for some reason, although as I sort of think about it, that price begins to become less and less appealing. I think he's been through very much the worst of what this can throw at him. And regarding vaccinations and rollouts, we vaccinate large amounts of people for flu every year. It's not as if this is completely alien to any government in the Western world, but I think that will be key. And also actually what happens in terms of January, February, sort of getting through to that stage. But it is good news, as I said, for the Conservatives. It will probably shorten them up. There could be a vaccine bounce in the same way there's an economy bounce or a restructuring bounce. And it'll be interesting to see if they take the lead in a few more polls.
Across the Atlantic Ocean, the Georgia runoff race we have to talk about, and obviously Donald's gradual kind of realization that the game is up as well.
Yeah, so really interesting because Trump actually tweeted that he doesn't want his followers to ignore the Georgia race, which is interesting. It suggests that people in the Republican Party have had a word with him and are asking for his support. Now, he's still fighting these frankly ridiculous claims that, he won the election or whatever, but he's won for 39 now in legal cases. It's not happening. The transition has started. I believe he will leave just about. Probably he'll go to Mar-a-Lago and not come back or whatever. I think also he's probably. I think I wouldn't be surprised if he tries to go back to sort of being an apprentice candidate and runs in 2024. And we have seen support for him to do that. He's a 7-shot, one of the best backed in the field, which is interesting, but also understandable. Also, interestingly, a good running point before we get to Georgia. Trump is a 7-2 favourite to be the Republican nominee in 4 years. Haley is 6-1, right? Wow. Pence is 10-1. And Ivanka Trump and Ted Cruz and Tom Cotton, who I think is big value, I think Tom Cotton is set for big things, is 16-1. We're 7-4 Joe Biden the favourite to be the Democratic nominee, and we're 9-4 Kamala Harris is. Now, I think that price is going to come in. I think that price will come in for a lot of support. I would not be surprised.
Kamala's price.
Yeah, I think people will look at 9-4 for her to be the nominee and they'll go, wow. So just going off that quickly and back to the Georgia runoffs, this is a really interesting race to me for lots of reasons. Now, obviously it's important. The Senate is up for grabs here. But there are other factors too. Namely, firstly, the Trump on-ballot, off-ballot effect, which is important for the midterms, important for the 2024 election. The same thing with Joe Biden. These states also, states like Georgia, are becoming more purple. You had Democrats underperforming down ballot, but they were good enough to be competitive in the initial election. And yes, I know Georgia hasn't elected a Democratic senator since the 90s, but the voter registration drives, the door knocking, all of that had a really big effect. And you look at it, falls on the Republicans retaining control of the Senate, which I think looks right, if a bit stingy. We're 7-4 over Democratic challenger you know, the race again is tighter than that according to the polling data we have, which is another fascinating subplot, by the way. Polling versus punters again, going head to head. And I just wonder if come a point, people will begin to think, are we looking at gift horse in the mouth again? They didn't with Biden, but the state results went a different way. I wonder what they'll do in Georgia.
Before we finish up, it does look from your lighting today that you've rather been sent from God, William, with this kind of light just over your head. But be that as it may, we still give our punters and obviously our fans the opportunity to engage in a little Q&A with you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for the responses. I'm really enjoying these Q&As. Adam Heath, who has an at the same name, asks me, who would win in a street fight? Keith Starmer or Alexander de Pfeffel? Alexander de Pfeffel, of course, signifying Boris Johnson. Now, this is interesting because it inspired me to go to our archives. There was a challenge laid by Boris Johnson when he was recovering from COVID down to Keir Starmer to do push-ups. He challenged him to push-ups, and I think Starmer jokingly accepted the invitation. We priced this up. I think it was first 20. We made Starmer 12s on. I imagine for a fight, we probably, I mean, I could get in touch with our boxing traders, but you'd make Starmer favourite. I would have thought. Certainly for a no-holds-barred street fight, I think he's got the physique you want. Neil Channing asked us who will come second in the London Mayoral election. I'd say it should be Sean Bailey, although he's running such a bad campaign, I would not be amazed if he manages to get that beat. We're looking to having that market put up. Interesting question via the DMs from Sajid, from our friendly competitor Markets. He asked me, what political events am I looking forward to this year? I presume this year is 2021, local mayoral elections. I think it is going to be absolutely bonkers, particularly if by that time we're allowed to do things such as vote easily. I think it's going to be really interesting. Another thing also, Holyrood elections. Now, the SNP will win them. They'll win them doing handstands. They are quite literally 20 points clear. They're 20 pounds clear of the opposition. The interesting thing will be who will be the next First Minister. We're 92 the field. And also, you know, what's the length, what's the size of the SNP's win? And does that actually change anything in Westminster? Because we'll have had Brexit by this point. It will take its effects early. That's going to really put pressure on the union. Things such as Scottish independence, obviously that's a big cause. Watch out for Welsh independence too. It's a smaller movement, but Scottish independence was smaller, a lot smaller than it was, and it's changed quite rapidly in 6 years. You know, 2010, the SNP were a thing, right? But they were not as big as they are now, and I think that's really interesting.
Actually, just on that, so in terms of natural resources and all that, does Wales have a similar sort of case to put to its voters as the Scots would?
No, because they don't have that clash between two democratic results. Wales actually voted to leave. It was a bit of a Brexit signifier, sorry, and that is, I think, one of the big things driving the independence movement in Scotland. But that said, the cause of Welsh independence, it's not insignificant. It's something that you could easily see growing. And you know, the union is not as strong and robust as it was even 5 years back, 10 years back, and I think that'll be a big factor in British politics for time to come. Fascinating
times ahead, William. Thank you as ever.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, that was the polling station, and we will talk to you next week.